Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to Boundary Break, the show where we basically take a camera anywhere we want to try and find secrets and discoveries in some of our favorite games. My name is Snipey, I'll be your co-host for today, and I want to give a massive thank you to Franz Bauma, whose camera tool I used for this episode. Now today is kind of a special video because we're looking at The Witcher 3, so strap in, I've been pushing it off long enough, I want to mentally prepare you for this next clip, because the first viewer request, I have to get out of the way first. When Geralt is in the bath, it's so stupid. When Geralt is in the bath, and indeed when he's naked at any point in the game, he's kind of modeled like a Ken doll, so there's just nothing going on down there. So his crotch area is just a flat skin texture. A weird thing that I saw that was pretty consistent across my entire time getting footage is that when I froze the game to take a look around with the camera, some of the character models that were really far away from me and facing the other direction would be kind of glitched in this really weird way, in different ways too, so some of them would have their faces being stretched in crazy proportions. All the parts of the face that you can imagine moving are kind of pulled down like goo. This can happen with any character, and it kind of doesn't really matter the distance that much. It does happen a lot more often when the characters are really far, but it can happen to those that are really close by. Also, sometimes different parts of the model wouldn't line up, like the head and hair would be completely separate. And for this one over here, we have, you know, the very normal looking cow, right? The model is just one big chunk. It's sort of seamed down the middle. It's just a cow. Over on the other side, though, you may have noticed that this other cow is very, very tall and is just stretched vertically. But look at them. They're perfect. And speaking of perfect, we've actually got the perfect sponsor for this episode, AFK Arena, which recently partnered with The Witcher 3 in order to bring Geralt and Yennefer into the game as new heroes, along with a brand new story for players to enjoy. With both games taking place in fictional fantasy worlds featuring monsters and magic, it's a no-nonsense matchup that brings CD Projekt Red's critically acclaimed RPG into a classic idle RPG. You can try both characters for free for 3 days, with ways to redeem them afterwards for free, or you can purchase a bundle to claim them outright. And because of the nature of idle games, where you're able to progress through a game without mandatory interaction or active engagement, in AFK Arena, you don't need to spend a lot of time grinding gear or leveling up, as you can auto-collect resources even while you're away. All you have to do is check the game from time to time, and your team will be getting stronger. In turn, you can focus on enjoying the various gameplay modes available, like PvE stories, dungeons, raid bosses, arena, king towers, and more. And this isn't even AFK Arena's first time collaborating with other well-known franchises either, as they've partnered with Assassin's Creed, Persona 5, and even Overlord before. So click the link in the description or the pinned comment to try out the game for yourself. And massive thank you to AFK Arena for sponsoring the video. Clothing is also pretty cool. Most outfits are made up of a ton of interwoven parts, and for a lot of objects, instead of having holes, they're modeled as fully solid. You can see this mainly at junctions like shoulders, or the neck, or the waist, and because of the layered approach of high detail clothing, you can kind of guarantee that when the material is changed, it becomes a sort of separate object, especially for any set of clothing that leads into the next one. Geralt's gloves are a great example of this, because instead of being just one solid object, it's actually made up of 3 different elements that kind of overlap and extend into each other, that being the main sleeve of the arm, followed by that first inner glove, and then capped off at the end with the actual outer glove, which itself is just one single model. There's no one way to go about it either, like for a shoulder armor, with the first 2 pieces actually being just one object along with the sleeve. I mentioned overlapping before, and a really good way to show that is with skin. Like how Geralt still has most of his neck, even though not all of it is able to be seen by the player. It's basically rendered just a little bit further than you'd think it needs to be. You can see the same thing on characters with really loose sleeves or holes in their sleeves, with the arm extending just a bit further past the point of visibility. Sometimes characters do have a lot more of their body rendered than you'd think, like this fisherman guy, who has his whole chest still there under his shirt. Also, not to surprise you, but pretty much in every situation where you see a character wearing a helmet or a hat, you can safely assume that they're bald, or have their hair shaved in a buzz cut sort of way. It kind of just depends on what the base model ends up looking like. This is done because there's no way to see the hair, so why have it? And in a similar vein, I think that's why these hooded bandits wearing a mask have their ears inset a slight bit, though it appears like part of the hood and the ears both converge on a single point inside the head. I can actually show you what it looks like when we move away from a character far enough to where they start deloading. And one of the first things we lose is the hair. First, it becomes a low detail mesh, where it kind of becomes this solid object chunk thing, before disappearing entirely. In this case, leaving the base model's hair behind, which just looks like a buzz cut that's been textured on. Following suit is the rest of the character's body, leaving just a floating head. And in Geralt's case, his facial hair is actually the first thing that ends up disappearing from him. In a similar manner to what you'd see in other games, when there's a cutscene happening in The Witcher 3, there's tons of information being loaded in on pretty much every camera cut. So looking at them from an outside perspective will end up showing a lot of those changes happening in a manner that can sometimes look sporadic. But trust me, these are very calculated scenes that are making sure that the player can see what they need to in the most efficient way possible, while still maintaining their cinematography. And since these changes happen super quick, like pretty much just a frame, all that's needed is a camera shift and it's pretty much unnoticeable. These same principles extend to even the dialogue scenes, which you can pretty much treat like a cutscene, though characters in dialogue do tend to be a bit more static, unless they have a very unique animation, like walking around or interacting with other objects. Let's take a look at some of the low-poly objects in The Witcher 3. First up, of course, we have low-poly birds. And interestingly enough, there's actually multiple different kinds of low-poly birds depending on the map and environment. So each bird actually looks pretty different, even though it's not really too noticeable at a distance besides color. They do share a lot of the same principles though, with a full 3D body mixed with tail, and flat wings that pivot in 2 spots in order to animate flapping. Their faces are also very simple, with their beak being a cone and their eyes being flat images. They also have a very distinct lack of legs. For higher detail models of the birds, they're definitely far less simplistic. The ravens, for example, are fully 3D, including their eyes, and their wings are objects with depth that can be bent and animated in a lot more places, but they're also not connected to the main body of the raven. Here's also a quick look at a low-poly boat. You can see that even though a lot of the details are simplified and lost, you can still easily distinguish the shield and sword from the figurehead, as well as the ship's helm. And in case you were curious, here's what the inside of Geralt's face looks like. And there's a couple of cool things to see on the eye, one of which being on the inner corner of each eye, where they've actually modeled the lacrimal caruncle, which is what that thing is called, by the way. The backsides of the eye are also a pretty weird sight, because instead of having nothing there or just being a mirror of the front of the eye, there's a triangle stretched into the middle with the texture of the front of the eye. And it's a little hard to see at this angle, but this eye does have a cornea on it, rather than just having the eye be a reflective ball. You can see it distort at certain angles, but that's just Geralt's eye. And other characters and creatures in the game have a slightly different style. Some of them just have no eyes, or a slight indentation on their face to represent what is supposed to be like an eye socket. And this is for creatures that are pretty much dead, like the rot fiends, which are walking around as shambling corpses. There's also the dead griffin that you come across pretty early on in the game, which also has had its eyes removed. When you're dealing with a live griffin though, the eyes are pretty similar to Geralt's, even when it's been decapitated and hooked onto your horse, with that hook going right through the old peeper. And surprisingly, a lot of animals you come across will just have flat textures for eyes, like this dog. The fur on this dog is also pretty similarly using flat image textures, but layering it in a way to give the general appearance of fur. If you'll allow me to go back to the griffin for a moment, it's pretty much how the wings are constructed too. Anyway, the closest direct parallel we have to the dog from before is this wolf, which has its fur rendered through a whole bunch of individual strands of hair. And we have a different back of the eye to talk about, because the back of this wolf's eye is just a flat representation of the front of the eye, which is a pretty common thing across all the different dog models in the game, including the wild dogs and this very friendly dog. If you've played The Witcher 3 before, there's a good chance that you've ran to the edge of the map and discovered that you cannot go any further that way, and then it will teleport you back to the main location that you were supposed to be in. But you probably saw that there's a whole lot more map to go that way, and you're right. The edges of the maps can extend pretty far past what the player is able to go down. A lot of cracks show pretty quickly though. Since the player is not able to go over here, there's not really a need to make everything look perfect. So you'll end up seeing the occasional thing that just doesn't quite fit. You'll see this most often in just map generation in general, or at least the terrain height map, where certain spots of the terrain will not smoothly transition between heights. But once you get out of the bounds of a map, they're not really focused on how the map will flow into itself once it passes a certain threshold. So you'll end up getting a whole bunch of variation in the map layout that is not consistent with the rest of the map as it's been portrayed. But that doesn't mean that they stop trying to give you the illusion that there's more to the world than you're able to visit. In this part of White Orchard, there's a silhouette of a town off in the distance that you can't actually get to, and And you can't really get a good look of it as the player, but here's what it looks like close up. It's just super low level of detail objects with really low resolution textures that are kind of merged into the ground. And there's a lot of this area here. The town itself is pretty big, but there's also a whole bunch of structures underneath the ground, which would never be able to be seen by the player. And in the Vizima Palace, which you can't go outside of, there is still an outside that's been loaded in and looks partially completed, which leads me to think that there's more to this map that was planned and eventually cut, or it was maybe used as a testing ground for map-making tools, since there seems to be a lot of random raising and lowering in the ground level, and a whole bunch of trees that don't really need to be anywhere. And when you bring the camera really high up, you'll see that this map is just a square. And that's going to be the case for every map in the game. You'll notice that some of them do have giant chunks missing out of them, but it's still a giant square, for the most part. Even the Skellige Isles, which have a lot missing from them actually. But that's only because water will only render a certain distance from the camera in a square form. And though that distance is pretty far, when we do a zoom out, it just means that any area on the map that doesn't have any ground, which was usually covered by water, will no longer be covered by water and will just be a black empty space. And for the most part, the water is always there. Yes, even below you, there is a water layer that is constantly there. Even if it's not rendered when you move the camera below, it will have the camera effect of you going underwater. So even though at the edge of the map you see a very distinct edge to the water, it's still going, technically. And this water layer is pretty malleable. Say you have a basement in a building, or just some part of the building that goes deeper into the ground. Sometimes the water will just be stretched downwards, which looks a little strange. But sometimes there's large chunks of this water mesh that will just be extended into the ground for seemingly no reason. And though it can be really hard to see, there's this area in Valen that has the water pulled down below it, which I think shows off what I'm talking about pretty well. And I did find one particular instance where the water level was despawned entirely, which gives us this funny look at a boat that is just floating in the air, but also a closer look at the ground beneath the water without having a filter get in our way. And there's a lot of unique textures here, for having different elements of the ground like rocks, sand, and dirt kind of coagulating in very specific areas to just darker colors overall, with the ground having a smoother, more reflective appearance. And when it comes to a large area of ocean, we can see just how deep the water actually gets at certain points. And because of that depth, mixed with those darker, smoother colors and lack of detail, when that fog fades in at a distance, it kind of looks like there's still water there. And in different areas of the map, the ground can look either more grassy or more volcanic in a way. I say volcanic, but it's more like really smooth rock, with the way that it's redirecting light, giving it an almost glassy appearance. There's these very thin parts of the ground that are sticking up all over the place, and they move with the camera. Now, these thin sections aren't usually visible. Sometimes they'll show up on the outside border of the map where you can't really see it, or in this case, underneath the water. But what this is actually a tiny look into how the map is constantly loading in as you traverse across it. And we can get a better angle of that here at the edge of the map, where we can see that the highest level of detail mesh and the most complex mesh of the floor is rendered closest, but is constantly loading in as you move forward, in very small sections, followed by a slightly less detailed one that's a little bit bigger and slower to load, followed by an even larger one that's also kind of slow to load, followed by an extremely big one, which is very low detail and takes the longest to shift out of all of them. In the beginning of the game, you visit Kaer Morhen for the first time, though it is in a flashback and you're not able to explore a whole lot of the map. It's actually pretty linear. You go through about 2 rooms in the main castle, and then out in the courtyard you go through a linear pathway. If you try to leave this pathway, it will kill you, but luckily I had cheats turned on so I could walk around on the outside. And since these maps are super large and you come back here later anyway, this is just the normal map with elements of it locked off to the player, rather than its own separate map for this sequence in particular, which means if you can break out of the castle, you can explore the entirety of the map. This means as far as walking around goes, it'll be pretty normal, as in you can still be attacked by bears. And maybe it's because of the mountainous terrain, but this map actually has a ton of out-of-bounds details past the point of player traversal. Like, there's a few extra forests, and yeah, some of them are floating, but it's still a lot of extra trees, and these are fully 3D trees. The mountains also extend pretty far, with varying levels of detail depending on how far away you actually end up getting, with those furthest having some really low-resolution textures across them. By the way, in case you're wondering what a mountain looks like close up, here you go. It kind of shares the same elements as the underwater sections, where part of the terrain is kind of extra reflective and super low resolution. In this case though, it's selling the illusion of snow, or snow-covered mountains. There are the same quirks that we see in the other maps too, where the terrain will just randomly jump up in height for no reason, or you'll have ravines that don't end up leading anywhere in the end. And for this river above the waterfall, not too far up it, there's just a chunk completely missing out of it. There's a lot of spaces in The Witcher 3 that are inside of geometry, whether that's inside of a mountain or below a city floor. And I want to show you guys a couple examples of how they pull that off. So these interiors are usually pretty self-enclosed, but they're not turned into separate maps or anything. They are connected to the outside world, and they have a whole bunch of large objects that work in tandem to create the actual boundaries of whatever you're in. So if it's a cave, it's a lot of different rock elements that are used together to create a cave system, and these can get pretty intricate, some of them being long enough to not even have all the elements loaded in at a single time. And while most of that is pretty standard, what's interesting is that in The Witcher 3, a lot of these elements are rendered on all sides. Like for this underground section of a city, where there's a pretty large section of rooms connected by tunnels underneath the ground. So it can be pretty interesting seeing how this interior layout flows together to create an inside space. And speaking of inside spaces, on the inside of this building, other than the fact that another building is merged inside of it, there is a large gray box. Now, this is possibly a leftover from earlier in development, but I can't be certain, so I'll leave this one up to your interpretation. Here's a close-up of some plants, and how they interact with the camera as it moves around. The more bush-like ones follow the camera's orientation, but only in the middle of the plant. The top seems to be its own separate element that stays in place. And then for the yellow and pink flowers, they're just perpendicular textures, which allows them to crowd up and have the illusion of being three-dimensional. And then when they're animated to sway side to side, it looks pretty convincing. And to cap off the video, I wanted to take a look at the Skybox, or how the Skybox animates throughout times of day. Now, the Skybox appears to be filled with static elements like stars, the moon, and the sun, that rotate around on the inside of a sphere. And even though the stars get traded out for a blue sky when the sun comes up, the moon actually doesn't go away at any point. It just goes underneath the map. And the sun and moon seem to both be animated, with the sun animating how bright it is at any given point, and the moon being animated as spinning around and swapping cycles as it goes across the sky. So I'm not sure if anybody thought that the fictional fantasy universe of The Witcher had the Earth and Moon, but the answer is it does not, because we only see the same side of the moon, all the time. Anyway, that's kind of all there is to talk about The Witcher 3, at least as far as I got into the game. Again, it's massive. Please go play it yourself if you haven't already. But I do hope you enjoyed the video, and whatever day you're watching this, I hope you have a great one. Also, since this video is kind of a stand-in for She Says' video this week, you'll have another video to watch from me next week on Halo 2, so look forward to that. Anyway, I will see you in the next one, and bye.